Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I rise to support the second stage of Mr Blair's Private Members Bill and to concur with Mr Stalford and other members earlier in this debate. Generally, and on the point of principle, I fully support what Mr Blair is trying to do in this bill, because this type of sport is barbaric. And I think at this point, listening to the contributions that we've heard just previous, I think it's a differential in defining what we mean by sport and what we mean by instinct. You know, it's almost the difference between prevention versus encouragement. And this bill is trying to stop encouraging humans to encourage their animals to this type of animal abuse. Indeed, listening to other members who do raise interesting points in conflict with this proposed legislation do so on the basis of detail rather than principle. And I'm not sure at this point if it is actually necessary to amend Mr Blair's bill to address these points, whilst giving effect to stop this form of animal cruelty. But I do think it is something we should look at if these are genuine reasons as to why people are uncomfortable with this bill. I appreciate Mr McGlone's contribution in this area. So for about 5 minutes, a number of years ago, I was the Minister of Justice, and I met with Mr McGlone and a delegation of those involved with country sports. It's not a support that I have ever been interested in or I am particularly familiar with, so I do actually reflect their experience and their expertise in this area. So when Mr McGlone, in all fairness, is raising concerns, I do think we have to be cognisant to some of those. And I won't be disingenuous, because I am supporting this bill, because this abuse does need to stop. However, if we can reassure or satisfy, even in the next stages, those who raise valid concerns on the unintended consequences, then I, as others have indicated as well, would be happy to look at those. Specifically, Mr McGlone raised issues in relation to firearms certificates. So again, in my previous role, I had experience of this. Mr McGlone is right that it is the firearms branch in the PSNI who are responsible for granting and revoking licences. And in cases of appeal, the process sometimes ends with the Minister of Justice. So I have read my fair share of firearms appeals. And Mr McGlone again is correct that a criminal offence is not necessarily required to remove a firearms licence. Other reasons can remove it too. And I do think that's fine if these reasons are informed, unbiased, proportionate and thoughtful of risk. But human nature is such that error and bias are inevitable in some cases, and perspective also has an... Yeah, sure.
Appreciate the member giving way. Reference to be made obviously to clause 6, and Mr Blair will be able to address this. I suspect the reason why that clause is included, or particularly the one that Mr Ellis referred to, I suspect the reason why that is included is because of the deceitfulness that we have seen from hunts in England and Wales, whereby trail hunting and drag hunting has been used as an opportunity to try and get round the law that exists there.
I thank Mr Stalford for his intervention. I suppose to try and draw it back to the point that I was making. Yes, I think it is such that human nature is that people will do those things. But that, at the same time, doesn't mean that we shouldn't write good law in this respect. And certainly, again, I fully support this bill. But if we can make it better, does that not get to where we all want to be in terms of those things? So I suppose that, and the point that I was trying to make was actually something in response to what Mr Stalford had said earlier in terms of intent, in that is it enough to assume intent given that all the potential variables that do alter perception, or do we need to strengthen this law so that the unintended consequences, again, that Mr McGlone and others speak of, are not reached? So again, clarification, I do support this bill, but if we need to strengthen it, then that's something that we need to do. Let's take it to the next stage. Let's get it to a point where we need to and stop the abuse and address those concerns that members have. Excuse me, like all members, I too have received a lot of correspondence from constituents on both sides of this debate, to the end that John has his own folder in my email inbox. Anecdotally, I would say that I probably have received more from those who support the bill, but there are many reasons which this could be the case, so I don't intend to focus on the numbers, but rather the reasons outlined. And overwhelmingly, people do see this as cruel, unnecessary, outdated, barbaric, and I do agree. And the counter-arguments in this vein do nothing to persuade me otherwise. I received correspondence, as I'm sure others have, describing this activity as traditional, social, harmless. My goodness, it is not harmless, and it can only be described as harmless in a world where animal welfare is disregarded. And it's not the world we live in. I'm sure in some areas it is, It's not, it's not where we need to be in 2021, and it is interesting to hear contributions from others where this debate happened over 10 years ago, and some of the same arguments were being put across. But Northern Ireland, it can exist in its own bubble, but this one really does need burst. Because abuse, sadly, can be social. It is most definitely traditional, but that does not make it right, or indeed a behaviour that we should continue to accept because that's what we always have done, or crudely because it's someone's hobby. And similar to the points raised by Mr Glone and others, there is the concern, and just recently we've heard that from Mr Alister and others, and I'll quote it, that a person participating in any activity where they have a dog and that dog pursues, chases or follows a wild animal, then that person engaging in that or other activity is participating in hunting for the purposes of the bill and therefore could make them a criminal. Now, I did not interpret that from the draft legislation, but I'm not legally trained. Mr Alister is, so maybe he raises a valid point. So I suppose what I'm asking Mr Blair, and even just in terms of the point Mr Alister made about a strict liability offence, that's the offence that's currently is drafted. Can we mitigate that in some way so that it doesn't put that strict liability offence onto those people, so that it isn't a case that if you're walking your dog that you will potentially be committing an offence? Let's not make this an excuse to do something which is right. Another compelling argument for me, usually in these types of debate, is that we are the only region of the UK not to have this law. Now, we don't always have to fall in line with other regions of the UK or indeed Ireland, but certainly other areas of the UK and Ireland who broadly are like-minded with us and have a similar set of circumstances and environment have now set a standard against animal cruelty. So why then do some in this House want to be at odds to that? Why are they opposed to positive legislation and our policy which wants to remove a form of animal cruelty? That's a really odd key message. And I appreciate if it is in the detail, let's work on that, rather than throwing out something positive for Northern Ireland that quite a lot of people, probably the majority of people, want to see ended. And again, I will reference Mr Stalford. This is second stage. Surely the principle is to stop this type of animal cruelty, and I really don't understand how anyone would be opposed to that. Turning to a notable justification, perhaps made by other members, saying there is not enough time in this mandate to get it through is a really poor argument not to support this piece of legislation. And it will be really interesting to see if that same rationale is applied by those members to other bills in this mandate, particularly from their own party. Let the process fail this bill. Let 3 years of no government fail this bill. But don't fail this bill or through mealy-mouthed tactic to ride both sides of this argument because you're worried about an election next year. If the practical concerns really are your driver, then at least send a message, a key message, that this form of animal cruelty is wrong by supporting this stage of the bill. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.